Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Polar Bears International's live chat, live from the tundra on Buggy 1 on the shores of Hudson Bay near Churchill, Manitoba. My name is Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International, and we're very happy that you're joining us after Polar Bear Week, but there's still a couple weeks left of Polar Bears, so stay tuned. Today's theme of the live chat is polar bears around the world. So we will be talking to a few of the current experts on board about their experiences with polar bears around the globe. But the big goal, as usual, is to take your questions. So please let us know what you want to know. And it's been a pretty wonderful morning of bear activity. Man, you guys are taking some really good shots. I know yesterday was a little bit slow. We had a lot of winds, just kind of gray day yesterday. Not a ton of bear activity. We were wondering if maybe they were kind of making their way out of this area. But today we sure had a lot of awesome stuff going on. We had a bunch of bears at the lodge. We've had these two doing some playing out front, which has been really cool to watch. They're taking a little break now, but these guys are just outside the window, so we still have a pretty good view of them, and we will keep our eye on them to see if anything else is happening. So I guess I should let you know who else we have on board today. So I'm going to go around the room and pull everyone off of their computers to say hi to you, and then feel free to ask any questions depending on what you want to know. So let's start. We'll start with Megan. Can you please introduce yourself and tell the Explore audience a little bit about what you do for work?
Sure. My name is Dr. Megan Owen, and I am a wildlife biologist at the San Diego Zoo's Institute for Conservation Research. I get to specialize in bears, and so I devise and manage bear research projects on a number of bear species. And polar bears just happen to be probably my favorite species to work with, but they're all truly fascinating.
Thank you. Megan really does some very, very cool research, so we are lucky to have her on board. And let's go over here to Kyle. Kyle, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly, my name is Kyle Armour. I'm a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I work on things like Arctic sea ice and the role of sea ice in the climate system.
Great. Well, we're sure lucky to have a sea ice climate person with us this week. This is a funny format. I feel like I'm a reporter. I'm like a polar bear reporter. Okay, the next person on board is someone I've known for about just over 5 years now. This is Nick. Nick, can you tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Nick Pilfold. I'm a research scientist at the University of Alberta, and I study polar bears and Arctic seals.
Well, now you know who's on board today, and we'll talk a little bit about polar bears and the ecosystems that they inhabit. So maybe we'll all keep standing, and maybe I'll pull these guys in one at a time. So we talked a little bit in the last few weeks about this population. So we are in the western Hudson Bay polar bear population near Churchill, Manitoba, of course, and this is the best studied population on the planet, really, and that's largely due to the accessibility. So if we look across the Arctic, a lot of those areas are really hard and really expensive to get to. And Churchill, it's relatively hard and expensive compared to a regular area, but for polar bear research, there's really, it's the best place to be cost-wise. And there's an amazing research center here that we can stay at. There's bears really close. We know where to find them. When we're going out in the fall to do field work, we know we're going to find polar bears. Nick and I were talking the other day. We did a field season, what was that, 2011? 2011, we were up in the Beaufort Sea with Andy DeRoche, and we flew for a full day one day, over 8 hours of flying, and we did not see a single polar bear. And we covered a ridiculous expanse of land and nothing. And that would never happen in Churchill. You know you're going to see bears. It's just the area of the population where they're at, where they're going to be. So it's a pretty cool place. We know a lot about them, but it is important to remember that there are 18 other populations around the world. So there are 5 polar bear countries, Canada having 2/3 of the world's polar bears, but also Alaska, Greenland, Norway, Russia. So Canada, US, Greenland, Norway, Russia are the 5 polar bear countries that work together on polar bear management. And they work together pretty well, but of course each area has its kind of own way of managing things. The way that the U.S. and Canada manage polar bears is different, depending on, in the U.S. so it's federal, and Canada is territorial, provincial. And so it's kind of different. The U.S. shares one population with Russia and one population with Canada, so they've got 2. And then Norway's actually a pretty cool place. And Megan, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, or even BJ, or I don't know, who wants to talk about Norway? Because there's this really cool area in Norway called Svalbard where there's some incredible polar bear denning action going on. You want to come? I'll give you the mic.
Sure. We're talking about Svalbard amongst this group today because we are hoping to move into a study of maternal denning behavior in that area. And one of the reasons why it's important to study polar bears here in Churchill, but also study polar bears in other areas, is that the topography and the sea ice dynamics are really different in the different parts of the circumpolar Arctic. And the sea ice is also receding at different rates in the different parts of the Arctic. And so the rate and the dynamics of changes associated with climate change are going to vary throughout the Arctic region. So we'd really like to understand more about what the maternal denning dynamics are in the Svalbard population of bears. So it's a fairly high density of denning in some of the islands in the eastern Svalbard archipelago. And we're really excited about embarking on a study that capitalizes on some of the technological advancements that BJ Kirchhofer has been developing over the past 5 years or so.
There's BJ.
And so the kind of technology that he's been developing is going to allow us to collect really good resolution data in the field without necessarily having to be there over the entire winter, which is a real advance for us as scientists. It keeps the costs down, it minimizes disturbance to the animals in the area, and it allows us to capture that much more information about the bears. So it's a great thing.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to take a seat because I feel kind of goofy standing over everyone. So the footage that you're seeing right now, BJ, is that from your maternal den study in Alaska?
Yeah. So that's
Yeah, here. I'll let BJ talk.
Yeah, so that's some of the stuff we captured in northern Alaska, right when the bears come out of the den. So this is probably middle March, early April, sometime in there. This is from back in 2009. And you can kind of see, I guess the footage is looping there, but towards the middle left of the image there's a bit of jumbled snow, and that was actually the den structure. And this was a radio-collared female that came out with one cub. And this is kind of what they do. Mom spends a lot of time rolling around in the snow, cleaning her coat. The cub spends a lot of time playing. And Mom also spends a bit of time looking out for potential dangers coming from, I guess, any direction. But this is it. This is rarely seen behavior at polar bear dens. And this is what we hope to capture in Norway as well.
Very cool. Thanks for that. This footage is pretty incredible. We can learn a lot about polar bears emerging from their dens, which is always a really important question that we ask about what's going on at such a critical time of life for little polar bears and moms. So we already have a lot of questions rolling in, so we can just kind of jump into some of those. Megan touched on this one a little bit already, but it asks if all of the other populations of polar bears are suffering the same conditions of late pack ice and early melt, and how are their populations holding on? We talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago, but it is different in the 19 subpopulations. So we know that ultimately sea ice, we are going to lose sea ice if nothing changes. And whenever we lose sea ice, polar bears are impacted. However, at the moment, we are seeing the polar bears who are impacted now are the ones that have the sea ice loss now. There are polar bear populations currently who are doing okay, who have their sea ice is still relatively the same. It's not been too impacted yet. We have we have a status table. It's called the PBSG status table. You can look up. It's updated every year. It's kind of the most up-to-date that's possible version of how all the different populations are doing. And we have some that are stable, some that are data deficient, so we don't know what's going on, some that are declining, and I think one or two at different times are increasing. So this is not a doom and gloom thing, but we do know that where there has been documented sea ice loss, we have seen decreases in polar bear populations. So it is very different. We also know that we talk about 4 different ecoregions of sea ice across the polar bear world. So Hudson Bay is seasonal sea ice. So that is sea ice that completely freezes and then completely melts each year. And the bears here are used to that, but bears in other populations may not be used to that if they're in different ice ecoregions. And now some bears are experiencing situations like that. So for example, in the southern Beaufort Sea population, the ice used to stay pretty close to the Alaska coast, even in the summer, and now it may be much farther out. And we're seeing more bears come ashore during that summer time now, and maybe that they haven't been used to that historically, and that could be impacting them. And we really want to make sure that these polar bear populations that are still doing okay hang on to their sea ice, that we don't see major changes there, and we know we can do that if we work together to lower the greenhouse gas emissions, which we've been talking about throughout polar bear season. We really want to make sure that we keep the 19 subpopulations in their 4 ecoregions of sea ice. We can all work together to make sure that that happens. So check out that status table. Maybe we can even get you guys a link in the comments to that if you want to take a look. Oh, this is cool. Nick, I'm going to ask you this question. So Nick is kind of like a hunting specialist, polar bear hunting seals guy. So Nick, what kind of hunting differences may you see between the populations of bears? Are these differences dependent on what kind of prey is available to them? We do know that different populations have different access to prey. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what you know about that?
So the 2 populations that we have the best data for are here in the western Hudson Bay and then in the Beaufort Sea. So I'm most familiar with the Beaufort Sea system. In that system, polar bears primarily hunt 2 types of prey. That's ring seals and bearded seals. 90%, something like that, of their prey comes from ring seals. And the other 10% comes from bearded seals. Although bearded seals are quite a bit bigger, so ring seals, they get up to around 70 kilograms. Bearded seals can get up to about 300 kilograms. So even though you won't see a lot of bearded seals killed in the Beaufort Sea, they are the big meal deal, the sort of like supersized version of a ring seal. So they're a good meal for a polar bear there. If we look at the diet out here in the western Hudson Bay, ring seals are still the primary item. Bearded seals are still hunted, but there's also harbor seals out here that provide an additional supply of prey for polar bears. So you can get different seal populations. If you go down to the Labrador coast, there's also big harp seal colonies down there. Polar bears get into those harp seal colonies, they can really do quite a bit of damage because the harp seals, pups, especially in the spring, are just out on the sea ice there. So yeah, you get a little bit of variability in terms of the types of seals that polar bears are eating, just depending on which populations are available to them.
Great, thank you. So we've moved closer together to make BJ's life easier with the camera. We also have the sun shining right on our faces, so sorry about that if that looks kind of funny. Thanks for that answer, Nick. Are there variations in size based on the location of the different populations? We think that there actually are. We know that the bears in this area have been getting smaller. They're about 10 to 15% smaller than they were about 30 years ago. Does anyone else have anything to add about size differences across the Arctic? No? No. It really, so some bears, so up near the Kaktovik area and they have those bone pile resources, they can get pretty darn big if that's a continued resource year after year. That's a lot of calories. I've heard polar bear biologists talk about certain areas up in the high Arctic where the bears maybe have a slightly different phenotype look to them. So Ian Sterling has a story about weasel bears that are up there, and they're kind of like these maybe kind of smaller, scrawnier looking bears. But I personally have not seen that, but that is an interesting choice. I think a lot of a polar bear size depends on their access to calories and food resources. And that's why we've seen a change here, is because we know there's the less access to seals compared to several decades ago, and we see a comparatively smaller body size. So, and they're not small. Let's not get the idea that these are small bears, because man, there's some big bears out here. We saw that huge one last week, I guess, was it, BJ? Yeah, that was the biggest bear I've ever seen out here, so that's pretty cool. He was a big boy. So the next question, okay, and this is a good one, really good one for you, Nick, because you're kind of working on this right now. It asks, how resilient are the bears? As experts, are you able to estimate how long their fat reserves may last?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. That's something we're actively working on right now. So one of the research assignments I'm working on is how much mass do bears lose every day that they're on land. And so that's a really important question, because the more time they spend on land, then we can start to calculate how vulnerable and how resilient they are to that extended period on land. So what we know is right now these bears, on average, lose about a kilogram or a little over 2 pounds per day that they're on land. And so a big adult male bear that has lots of reserves, some of those bears can last, over 200 days without eating. And have the ability to go for long periods of time. When you look at subadults and the younger animals, they don't have the same resiliency because, especially for subadults, they're still growing. Their fat reserves aren't as big. They're not as skilled hunters either. So when they're out in the spring, it's harder for them to put on the reserves as quick as it is for an adult that has more experience with hunting. Subadults are out on their own. They're trying it for the first few times. So one of the things we see here in Western Hudson Bay is that in the summertime, subadults are much more likely to try to access terrestrial food sources than adult males and adult females because they're likely trying to find something to add on to their food supply to make up for the fact that they have a lot of stress, sort of the growth stress that's in their life. But the real element that we're really seeing and what the research is really showing for the Hudson Bay population is the food sources that are on land do not replace what we have on the sea ice. So the weight loss is really consistent year to year. So one would think that maybe in a year where there's a really early breakup and a really late freeze, that might push bears more to try to seek out more terrestrial resources and fill that gap. But we don't see that. And we have a lot of empirical evidence over the last 40 years that suggests the longer the fasting period is on land, the worse condition these bears are in, the less likely they are to reproduce. And that's really because the terrestrial food resources don't fill that gap there. So yeah, that's a lot of information, but get back to the main point. It's about a kilogram a day that these bears are losing, and the resiliency there is it's not too strong. Yeah, they are vulnerable.
Oh, thank you. That is a lot of information, but it's really good information. And this community, I know, likes a lot of great scientific information. Thank you for that. Okay. Oh, and this is a cool question because one of the webcasts we did today, so this week our partner for the Tundra Connections webcast, which is our kind of educational outreach for schools, the theme was the curious case of the Growler bear. And we thought that would be a neat topic for kids. And we used the Growler bear to really talk about STEM and science. But one of these questions that just came in is, are there populations of brown bears breeding with polar bears? And maybe I can get Nick and Megan to weigh in on that. Do you want to start, Megan, and then hand it off?
Well, I think we've found two examples of Growler bears or grizzly bear, polar bear hybrids. And we've known for a very long time that there is some overlap in the range of grizzly bears in the high Arctic and polar bears. But finding these hybrids was a real revelation to many people, and it certainly begs the question: is this a phenomenon that's going to increase in frequency as the climate continues to change, and we have grizzlies moving farther north and polar bears in a larger proportion on land? But there's some really interesting characteristics of these bears that make it a really clear that it's not sort of a genetic rescue for polar bears. And for me, one of the most fascinating components is that these are hybrids that are being raised by their mothers as polar bears. And so the two examples that have been found on the sea ice. And so life on the sea ice is all about specialized adaptations, both behavioral and anatomical, to being good at making a living out on the sea ice. So all the adaptations that polar bears have, the type of claws, the skull structure, and the behavioral components that make them really good hunters of seals are things that they need to survive on the sea ice. And a hybrid, we don't know how much of those characteristics transfer over to the hybrid. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that they're on the sea ice. And so presumably a hybrid, a Growler bear hybrid, is going to be just as vulnerable to sea ice loss as a result of climate change as a polar bear.
A lot of really great points when people think that maybe the Growler bear is a super species of, yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. So I think part of the question was, where are we seeing Growler bears? Is that correct? Or well, we could talk about that if you want. So the Growler bears that we've seen are over in the Beaufort Sea side. So we're talking about the western side, the Arctic in Canada there. So we have those where the two examples come from. And I think I have an image, actually. I was up in field research a few years back. We were in McClure Straits. So McClure Straits, a little bit further north. It's in sort of the western side, the archipelago there. And what we saw, this is a researcher from the Northwest Territories government. She saw what is clearly a hybrid there. So you can see the difference in the eyes. You can see a very square head, so very grizzly-shaped head. The paws are quite a bit different. And the thing that I saw personally was I saw a grizzly bear running around out on the sea ice north of Banks Island. I think the image might be somewhere, but... Oh, okay. So sorry about that. So you'll just have to trust me at my word that we saw this grizzly bear out on the sea ice. So what we think is happening is as grizzly bears move further north, the males, which have larger territories than the females and really expand them to find mates, are actually going out onto the sea ice to look for mates. And really the main mechanism that they're using is smell. So they're trying to figure out where mates are based on scent and if there are females that are accessible for reproduction. And love's blind. So these male grizzlies are mating with female polar bears, and because they're close, genetically speaking, they're able to make successful hybrids. And the really kind of neat thing about the second example we have is that the second example is a bear that was 3/4 grizzly and 1/4 polar bear. So that means that one of the parents was a grizzly and the other parent was a hybrid. So one of the questions we usually have as scientists about hybrids is, are they actually viable on their own? And to test that is can they reproduce? And so what we saw there is, yes, that these bears can reproduce because the mother was a hybrid who had successful offspring. So it's interesting. The only thing that lacks right now for us is samples. We just have those 2 samples, and that makes it difficult to make a lot of inferences about what's going on.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see if we collect more samples over time, but really right now there's only so much we can say, but quite an interesting conundrum with that Growler bear. When the bears are on the sea ice, what do they drink? Snow? Megan? Or you can take it?
I can take that one. I like this one because it's a question that makes you kind of wonder, especially in the middle of winter when everything's frozen, what do you do for water supply, right? So the bears have 2 choices, essentially. You could go out and melt snow in your mouth, and that would give you a fresh water supply. But it's energetically expensive to do that because you got to heat that water up to the melting point and then digest it. So it costs a lot to do that. So one of the really cool things about polar bears is they have this high-fat diet, and they focus just in on the blubber of seals. And what happens is when that fat is digested, it releases water as a byproduct. So it's kind of like getting your food and drink all at once. So polar bears don't really need that access to water like we would think with a lot of other animals because it comes right in with their food.
That's a pretty neat adaptation. Yeah, cool. We do see polar bears kind of eating a bit of snow here, but they also haven't been eating large amounts of fat. They may be. Yeah. And I think sometimes they're picking up maybe some sense in that. I see them kind of where another polar bear's walked. They'll kind of eat the snow around the feet. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Megan was, if any of you remember the polar bears have smelly feet paper, I think we're going to get Megan to maybe talk about that a little bit because that was pretty cool. We had a lot of questions about that last year, Megan. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how polar bears like smelly footprints.
Sure. Well, sort of Nick already talked a little bit about this when he said love is blind. So, if you think about polar bears and we consider them solitary mammals. They have these incredibly large territories, or they roam over really, really large expanses. But when it's time to breed, they need to find a mate. And it's really expensive to follow in a direction blindly and not know whether you're going to find a bear. So what's been observed over a very long time period for people who live up in the Arctic is that polar bears might investigate the paw prints of another polar bear. And there have been certain scenarios where a polar bear has basically compared 2 different sets of paw prints and then preferentially followed after the paw prints of another. And in a few scenarios, we've actually known that those were females that they were following after, that a male was following after. And so we did an experiment a few years back, and we just looked at the information content of polar bear scent. And so we actually worked with USGS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska, and we had them collect the smell off the bottom of polar bear feet. And then we ended up presenting those smells to polar bears in zoos, and we measured the behavioral response. And what we found was that male polar bears were much more interested in female polar bear scent than male. It seems kind of obvious, but this is part of science, is we really have to look at things in a systematic fashion. We don't want to just assume something. Mm-hmm. And then we also looked at whether males could tell or had a preference for a female that would have been ready to breed versus one that would not have been ready to breed. And we did indeed find that polar bear males were much more interested in those scents than females that weren't ready to breed. And so it gave us this really nice insight into how polar bear communication with scent is tuned. The other side of that, though, of course, is that they're laying these scents on the sea ice as they walk. And so what happens as that sea ice begins to change and becomes even more dynamic or more fragmented? How does that scent trail that's left by a female, how is that impacted, and how much more energy might it take to follow? How much less efficient is that form of communication that's evolved over thousands of years? So it's one of these questions that is giving us some more knowledge about the basic biology of polar bears, but it has implications for conservation because things are unfolding so rapidly here in the Arctic.
Pretty neat. Science is pretty cool, you guys. Whoever's job it was to swab the smelly feet of polar bears. That's
Jeff York.
Oh, Jeff York, PBI's very own Jeff York. That's pretty cool. We'll have to and others. Yeah, that's very cool. And here's another great question for you. Would you please talk a little bit about polar bear vocalizations? Because that's also something you know a lot about.
Sure. Well, we do know that polar bears use scent to communicate, but they do vocalize from time to time. They're not highly vocal. The adults don't have a real wide range of vocalizations, but when you do see adults that are in close proximity to one another, whether they're playing or whether they're actually truly in an aggressive encounter, there will be vocalizations exchanged. And these grade from what we hear quite a bit is a chuff, and then there's growls and something that could be classified as a roar. But polar bear cubs, on the other hand, are really quite vocal, and there is a range of vocalizations that a cub in the den is going to emit to communicate with the mom. And in particular, there's a humming vocalization that's quite loud and quite persistent, and we really don't know what the true communicative function is of that vocalization, but presumably it's important because they do it a lot. It has to be energetically demanding, and it's sort of associated with nursing. And so one of our ongoing research projects is to see how important that is for appropriate maternal care behavior, and also, what is the potential for noises happening outside the den to disrupt or mask those vocalizations. So that becomes a real concern in Alaska, where maternal denning areas overlap quite a bit with oil and gas activities. Right. And those activities have been going on for decades, and we know that they're not an imminent threat to polar bears, generally speaking. But again, as the climate changes and females are really impacted energetically by the loss of sea ice, we don't know now whether they have enough energy to spare to deal with potential disruption from outside. So again, we're really trying to understand something that's a tremendous challenge to study because all this is happening 3 feet under the snow. Wow. So again, we're really looking to technology to try to develop ways to address this.
Right, which is very exciting. And on that note, there's a question, where was that one? So people are asking if polar bears hibernate, and if they do, would you put a cam inside a den to record data?
So yeah, polar bears don't hibernate. Pregnant females do go into dens, and certainly they're in there conserving as much energy as possible. The most we know about polar bear behavior inside a den is from zoo bears, because in a zoo den, we can put cameras in the den ahead of time, and we can mount them in such a way that we know they're not going to be intrusive to the bears. The bears aren't going to be able to get at them, so it's safe. And from that, we see basically what looks like a mother sleeping, but she's also attending to the cubs. And there is certainly a degree of wakefulness associated with that.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you.
Sure.
That's you're like the perfect person to ask these questions to, so that's really great. But we're going to circle back because, of course, we mentioned the Growler bear, and it is just super fascinating. So, Nick, I have a few rapid-fire Growler bear questions for you. Okay.
Do my best.
Okay. Were the growlers found in this population, and do other populations have any growlers? So, basically, where were they found? Are there existences where the mom is a grizzly and the father is a polar? And then can you pull that picture up that we had again, BJ? They're interested in that.
Okay, certainly. So we have not found any instances of growlers out here in the western Hudson Bay. The two observed growlers that we have DNA evidence for both come from the Beaufort Sea in Canada, so that's the western side of the Arctic. Sorry, I've already forgotten the other question.
And are there any existences where the mom is a grizzly and the
Oh,
father is a
right.
wolf?
We don't have any evidence of that yet. So that's why we think the main mechanism is actually male grizzlies out on the sea ice chasing around female polar bears, because that's what we've seen, anecdotally anyway, rather than vice versa, which would be male polar bears going into grizzly populations chasing around females.
Right.
So right now it seems the main mechanism is these grizzly bears are moving further north, and they're going out onto the sea ice and interacting with polar bear populations. And so that seems to be what's happening right now. But again, there's not a lot of evidence, so it's kind of fun because you can kind of play these scenarios out. But hopefully we get some more DNA over time and get this sort of mystery resolved.
Cool. Very interesting stuff, those growler bears. Okay, so this is a question. I'm not really privy to this information, but I know a slight bit about it. So people are actually wondering about the politics of polar bear management and the tensions between the U.S. and Russia affecting that. So with the Chukchi Sea polar bear population, there is a joint management with Russia and the U.S. I know they did have a meeting in September. If any of you saw Jack Omilak, who was here with us a couple weeks ago, he had just come straight to Churchill from Russia from those meetings. And I think as far as I know, I'm not sure how much national level kind of tensions influence specific polar bear stuff. I know that there's always a little bit of tension with polar bears. When we're talking about management and harvest and people using them, I know there's different opinions, but from what I heard, they were able to work out a good management plan that people were happy with. Jack seemed like he wasn't super exhausted or anything when he got here. He was ready to roll. Do you guys know anything specifically about Russia, U.S. stuff? I mean, it's kind of, Russia doesn't share as much maybe with Canada, or we don't hear as much about Russia stuff as Norway and some other populations. So we're really not as up to speed on the Russian data and what's going on out there as other populations. But I do know Putin likes polar bears, right? Like that's a pretty well-known fact. So that's pretty cool. And so hopefully they're doing okay over there. So here, where was that next question I saw? Okay, so this is kind of a fun question. I'm not sure if there's a real answer to it, but maybe I'll ask you guys your opinion. So of all the 19 populations, which is the hardest to study and where is it? And is part of the difficulty of studying these populations, or the most difficult population, due primarily to geography? So what do you guys think?
Stab at that. My guess would be is the Arctic population that exists in the basin. We really know nothing about it. So there's one subpopulation that's basically right over the pole, and we don't know if there's bears in there or not in there. So you're looking at the image up there. It's the big blue image in the middle. So in that area, we're not sure if there is a lot of bears. It covers a fairly unproductive area of water. The water is very sterile. There's not a lot of biological life to it, so we don't think that there's a lot of polar bears in there. But really, we have no idea at all, because there hasn't really been any commissioned surveys in there. That would be a really interesting place to go and study, but a very difficult place to study, as you can imagine, very expensive to get to, a huge geographical area to try to cover. We really don't know what is going on in that area at all.
Right, pretty interesting. And when we go out to study polar bears, we are out primarily in helicopters, which they do have limits on helicopters. There's only so far you can go. You need fuel every so often. It gets so cold up there. Of course, it's going to be very, very dark for a lot of the year. And there are a lot of obstacles. When you've got open water areas, it's dangerous to cross in helicopters. You have shifting sea ice. It's also dangerous. So there's just, some really tricky places to get to. Did you want to add anything to that?
I think, for polar bears, obviously the logistics, as we've talked about, are some of the most challenging you'll find on the planet. And so a combination of logistics that are sort of inherent to the topography or the ocean dynamics, coupled with resources. And a lot of different areas simply don't have the resources behind research that are required to do this kind of research. Another thing to think about, too, is that the best studied populations, of course, are ones we've been studying for decades. And the reason why we understand the dynamics and the trends over the past 20 years, 30 years, is because we've been studying them. And so it really requires a long-term commitment to study, and I think sometimes people are impatient. We want to know now what's going on, and that's understandable. But we need several years, decades of data in order to understand the dynamics. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of commitment is something that takes a lot of support from governments and scientific bodies as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that insight. Okay, so we have a cub question. Well, we have a couple cub questions, of course. Everyone loves cubs. Are cub litter sizes and mortality rates similar in the different populations? Does anyone have that information?
Well, I mean, litter size, I think, is a perfect thing to talk about here on the Hudson Bay. Historically, the Western Hudson Bay was one of the places that you would see triplets, and triplets is fairly unusual, but certainly possible for polar bears. And we've seen the average litter size decline here on the Hudson Bay, and that is declining pretty much in tandem with changes in the sea ice. And so I think you could also expect to see differences in litter size that reflects sort of natural dynamics in the sea ice as well. And so we do expect to see different litter size and cub survivorship around different parts of the Arctic.
And then in the same thread of cubs, is infanticide a big issue? And does infanticide only happen by big male bears, or do female bears kill cubs as well? Great question.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't know of any evidence of a female bear ever killing cubs. I don't know if Megan. In black bears, but yeah, I don't think we have any recorded observations of that in polar bears. Certainly, it is a risk, and what we see spatially is that the adult males and the females that have young cubs of the year, are spatially segregated. So here in the Western Hudson Bay, and during the summer, what you'll find is that the big males will be along the coastline, and the adult females that have cubs of the year, they'll be a little bit further inland to protect those cubs, to get them away from the adult males so that they're not exposed to that infanticide threat. In the study system that I work in the Beaufort Sea, we also see this in the spring. So when females come out of their den with their cubs of the year, they go out on the sea ice to hunt. And where they hunt is actually in near land fast ice areas. They're breaking into ring seal layers where they're having their pups, and that's their main prey. If you look at all the other bears, though, they're out at the shore fast lead, which is further away from land. So they're all hunting in a very high productivity area where there's more variation in the types of seals that they're going to be able to get access to. So not just spring seal pups, but juveniles and adults and bearded seals. And so it's a good high energy area, and that's where all the other bears like to be. So what we think is happening is those adult females with those young koi are in those near land areas to avoid the adult males that would be out in the shore fast ice boundary area. So yeah, we definitely see there's a lot of dynamics that play out that are based around that infanticide threat. So I would say it's a pretty high threat to young cubs. Yeah.
And we did have one cub killed here a couple weeks ago by a male in Eaton, and it's not really clear what that situation was. It happened between here and the town of Churchill, but that's the only one I know of so far this year. Well, and in this area, it's a pretty large area, and we're only in a really small piece of it. But yeah, it happens. It's not fun, but it definitely happens. Another question about cubs. So I think the other day we saw kois, but maybe we can talk about kois and yearlings, because it says the 4 cubs we saw a few days ago. So we saw a couple family groups a few days ago. Can they eat milk or can they eat meat or still drink milk, or both?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So from what we know is that polar bear cubs will continue to nurse throughout their time with their mother, but that time of actual nursing diminishes over that time. So a 2.5-year-old cub is at the end of its time with its mother, and it's going to be nursing very little, and it wouldn't be relying on that milk for its food unless the mother was not able to hunt successfully. But in that first year when the cubs are just emerging from the den and they're just starting to get out on the sea ice with their mom, and the mom will begin sharing meat with the cubs early on, but the cubs are still getting most of their nutrition from the mother mother's milk, which is incredibly rich. It's something like 35% fat. So it's just like drinking liquid butter, and it really helps the cubs grow and put on weight and have the energy they need to grow out there. Yeah.
What do we have next? Okay, here's an interesting one. What's a more difficult time in a polar bear's life? Is it A, when they're a dependent cub, or B, an independent subadult?
Good question. Yeah, I think they're tougher for different reasons. I think if we look just at survival numbers, the quantitative evidence, cubs, it's tough to be a cub. You know, the first year survival rates are around 50%. So, you know, that's a pretty high odd chance that you're not going to make it. So, from that part of it, yeah, it's tough to be a cub. But I think once you get to being a subadult, it doesn't get any easier, you know, because what happens is if you got a good mom and you've been able to make it through for that 2.5 years and you've been emulating her and figuring out how to hunt, what we see in the evidence is they still don't do a lot of their own hunting until they're actually forced to be off and pushed off by their mom. And then they have to really go out and try. And that's a learning curve. And so, you know, it's not easy being a subadult. They have difficulties hunting, and they're certainly exposed to a higher stress and mortality rate than adults are.
Megan, do you choose the same answer?
I do choose the same answer, and I do think that hunger is a great motivator. So I think you kind of probably, as a cub that's newly independent, that hunger drives a successful hunt.
Right. And we do see subadults getting into a little bit of trouble often too. I think they're just kind of learning where the food is and how to be bears. We do see, you know, some human bear conflict, or they're just kind of showing up in places where they don't need to be, and it takes them a little while to learn, to just stay out with the polar bears and not go. Exactly. Yeah, totally. Excellent. Okay, so a question that came up earlier that we saw, and we'd kind of talked a bit about it, but when we're talking about grizzly bears and polar bears, something that grizzlies are well known to do is cache their food. Do polar bears cache their food? And then I think someone's comment was, well, maybe they would need a microwave to heat it up after.
That's actually a really good point.
Right, yeah. Do you know anything about how that works?
I'll take a crack at this one. So what we've long suspected is that polar bears do not cache their food like grizzlies do. Grizzlies are definitely cachers. They'll put their food away. And it's just what Elisa said, which is that up in the Arctic, your food's going to freeze. And if you think about a seal being frozen to the ice at minus 40 degrees Celsius or minus 30 degrees Celsius, the amount of energy it would take to chew through the frozen tissue plus warm it up to a temperature in your stomach that's equivalent to your body size, or to your ambient temperature in your stomach, it's energetically expensive, and it reduces the value of that food source. So we've actually seen out on the sea ice seals that still have blubber on them that have been killed but are frozen right to the sea ice, and no bears come around to check it out. And it's actually a question that we've been thinking about doing a little bit of research on, just looking at basic principles and modeling and trying to see, okay, at what point does a carry-on item like a seal out on the sea ice, at what point is it no longer valuable to a polar bear because it's frozen, it's too cold, and they don't have a microwave to warm it up, right? Exactly. We have seen a couple anecdotal observations of what you might call caching, so that you might have seen recently there was a paper about dolphins that got entrapped near Svalbard and were hunted by an adult male. And that adult male, when the photographs were being taken, was halfway through covering the dolphin with snow, which is kind of caching-like behavior to cover up the kill. So what may have been going on there is that a dolphin's a big food resource. It's later in the spring when this happens, so temperatures are a bit warmer. So maybe what the bear was thinking was, I'm just going to cover this for now, hopefully not attract other bears to it, come back when I'm hungry again and eat again. So there is the possibility that caching occurs, but it's not the same as it is in grizzlies. Yeah.
Right. And often just the size of the prey. If a big male's gonna catch a ring seal, he can often eat a lot of it all at once. And then if a grizzly bear, say, was lucky enough to take down an elk, I mean, that's a lot for a grizzly bear in one sitting. So yeah, great questions, you guys. Well, those are all the ones that have come in so far, and it's been about 45 minutes. So I think we can start to wrap up, but we will definitely be in the comment section later. I love checking out all your snapshots. You guys really, man, you see some stuff that we don't even see out here. It's pretty darn cool. Thank you so much for joining us. Join us again tomorrow. Tomorrow we are talking about STEM, using science to study polar bears. And sea ice. Kyle, we're going to pull you in a bit more tomorrow too. Kyle uses some pretty cool science. All these guys in here use some pretty darn cool science to learn about polar bears and their habitat. And we've been really lucky to hang out with some really cool people for a few weeks out here. It's been lots of fun. Thank you for joining us. Keep an eye on these polar bears. The Northern Lights Cam also is doing some pretty cool stuff. So keep an eye on that too. If you are up late at night and can't sleep, that's a good thing to check out. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, if you can do your part to help polar bears, if you're interested in going to our website, seeing what you can do, check that out, www.polarbearsinternational.org. We have a petition for a carbon tax. You can sign a petition for polar bears. We also have a lot of other ideas, and we also love to hear from you. You can tweet us at Polar Bears on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, on our Instagram, reach out to us on the comment section, whatever you want to do. We love hearing about it. And we would love to thank our sponsors, of course, Explore.org for letting this all happen, Frontiers North Adventures for the donation of Buggy One and having those really cool Tundra Lodge cams out there, letting us all and our scientist friends stay out on the lodge while we're out here. They're just really great partners. Also, thanks to the Churchill Northern Study Center for hosting that Northern Lights Cam, among other things, and Parks Canada for the Cape Cams out there, also among other things. We've got a lot of really great groups working together out here to bring you polar bears and other cool northern stuff. So thanks to them and thanks to you for watching, and we will hopefully see you guys tomorrow. Bye.